Hi, my name's Bill.
And my name's Andy, and welcome to Triumph Tales.
I'm absolutely delighted to have a friend of mine, the CEO of Transcelestial, here with us, Mr. Rohit Jha. Welcome to it.
Thank you so much. It's been great knowing you for the last 4 years and stuff, and thanks for the invite.
Well, you're very welcome.
So, Rohit, thank you again for coming along. We've met a couple of times, but
Yeah.
I don't really know much about you. So, tell me about your background, how you ended up in Singapore, and I guess how you ended up with Transcelestial.
Yeah, Singapore's been home for almost 16 years now. Whenever someone asks me that question nowadays, I've been so used to fundraising now that I describe my life in 4 phases. Phase one is my life growing up in India. So I come from a very small town in India called Jamshedpur or Tata Nagar, which is the city of the Tatas. So that's where the Tata Group originally started. They set up their first industry called Tata Iron and Steel Plant, which they grow into a massive fortune, and then Tata Group is what it is today.
But were you exposed to tech during that period?
There's two things in hindsight that actually influenced a lot of who I am today. So number one is my schooling. So it was a Loyola School of Institutions. So those of you who don't know, it's set up by the St. Ignatius Loyola, which is a scientific order within the church. And eventually they made this huge network of schools around the world. So every 3 years or 4 years, what happens is you have all these priests who teach us all these advanced maths, astronomy, physics, chemistry, all of this kind of computer science. And they rotate every 4 years. So you get every 4 years people coming from Russia and the US and Brazil and all over the place. So they bring not only themselves, but also their experiences and literature and latest scientific magazines from the Valley and everything. So it was just this amazing schooling system that I grew up in, which is very different from anyone else in India. So which is just kind of weird and good in some sense.
Was it at school that you decided you want to go into the tech business?
Yeah, very much.
And what was the trigger after that made you want to start a business in the tech industry, which is way harder?
I just grew up in huge amounts of Arthur C. Clarke and Asimov. There's just tons of that and tons of fantasy. So you grow up imagining, you grow up being promised a world which is far more ahead in technology and science and engineering.
Where are the flying cars?
Where are the
I'm
flying
still
cars?
disappointed about that one.
So how
humanity
old
has
were
to be
you
transformed.
when you made that connection and said, this is what I want to do?
I first started reading Asimov when I was in 5th grade, which was 10 years old.
Wow.
Yeah. And very quickly realized, so the 3 laws of robotics and that whole robotics books by Asimov were the key thing driving me to start learning computers. So that's when at the age of 12, I kind of pestered my parents to get me a secondhand IBM PC, which didn't work because we were a very low-class middle family. So dad got a machine from his office, which didn't work. It was one of those things that were being sold for clearance. So I was like, well, I'm just going to clean it. Took it apart, cleaned everything, vacuumed everything, put it back, and it booted up.
Yeah.
And I was like, great, I have a computer. Started making games. At that time, I had very little or no friends, some would say. So I thought the way to winning friends would be to make computer games.
Were you the classical nerd at that point?
Very much, yeah. And it was an all boys school, so there was there was no girls, there was no distractions. It was just men being men, and it was super fun. But obviously, the whole build game and find friends strategy didn't work, obviously. But it did get me a lot of really good computer engineering skills very early on.
So was it coding that kicked it off?
Yeah, very much, 100%. So it was C++. Started looking at that, Visual Basic. That time it was just Basic, and a lot of C as well. That very early on. So
did you turn that into an employment?
Very quickly, actually. Even during high school and stuff, so HTML was all the rave. So this was late 97, 98, around that. So I was in high school. And at that point in time, there were a lot of businesses around the area who were oh, I want to just put up a static web page or something. And there's this kick-ass software called Adobe Dreamweaver, which is kind of out of print right now. But it was fantastic. You could just literally have tons of templates. You pull one, you do some coding, do some HTML. JavaScript was very, very minimal at that point, a lot of CSS. And you get a website up. So I could get some pocket change on and off.
So you mentioned NTU?
Yeah.
You studied here?
This too was just looking at NTU. So I had an option to join IIT Kharagpur, which is an hour away from my city. And when my mom said that she's going to visit me every weekend, I was like, right, what are my other options? And NTU was really good because I got a full scholarship here. I mean, with the full scholarship, they give you money on top to spend on books, which goes in booze eventually, and also 2 tickets back and forth to India, which was all great. It was SIA NOL, Singapore Airlines, and Neptune Orient Lines.
It's a compelling package.
It was a very good package. And the only kind of, I wouldn't say drawback, but the only kind of terms and conditions attached to it is you have to work here for 6 years after you graduate in any company that you want. It doesn't matter. Right?
So which course, which
So
areas did you study?
So I came here and I joined NTU's EEE, Electronics and Electrical.
Yep.
On the side, I did a minor in computer science as well. And because it was something that I already knew a lot of it, so it was an easy one for me to take on. But I think during that 4 years, ultimately it turned out to be a great, fantastic experience. And I have some of my best friends spread across like Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Americans, Europeans, and even like people from Pakistan and stuff, which is kind of like a hotly debated topic in India. So, but you have this huge amount of exposure
Real
very quickly.
cosmopolitan environment. Yeah.
Very. And you just realize like eventually people are people, right? Like people are very different from what politics is, right?
I've always believed in people are having to live overseas, and it's this process that I've always called denationalizing. Individuals have to be denationalized so that they're not constantly comparing my country versus this, my country. Once you're denationalized, it's like your virginity. It's gone. You can never go back.
100%.
You know, and I think it's just so important that people go through that.
Hugely. I mean, retroactively, this is just like a sidebar of a sidebar conversation. But they did a study looking at entrepreneurship and who starts companies and stuff. And I mean, this is heavily based on US data, but they saw that like in the early days, New York was a huge epicenter of like small to medium businesses. And the big reason for that was, some of the biggest, most successful businesses were immigrant-led businesses or immigrant-started businesses. And part of the reason of that was when you leave your country, you're leaving a community, you're leaving an identity, you're leaving richness and blah, 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 all of that
those
stuff.
are the visas they're trying to kill off nowadays. It's crazy, isn't it?
It is crazy, but when you go to a new country, you often seek that. And in the process of seeking that, your ambition builds, your capability builds, and you're propelled by an invisible force to start something, to rebuild that identity effectively.
Have you ever had any temptation to go back? I mean, there's a huge talent base coming out of India. I mean, it dominates the whole in Silicon Valley.
Yeah.
So all the startups in the valley, do you see people moving back into India and doing their own startups? I don't see a lot of visibility. What do you see and feel about returning Indians or nationals back to the home country and doing their own thing?
There's definitely a lot happening. There's like positive reasons and kind of, in my opinion, negative reasons why that's happening. There is a lot of influx back, not only into India, but also China right, today. And one part of it is like the growing amount of nationalism and the sentiment of nationalism. So everyone kind of feels more attached back to the image of their country. So that's one part that's driving. But a bigger one is the rising kind of taxes and polarity in the US and in most other countries because of nationalism. And the growing amount of, I would say, the ease of doing business in India. Many people can argue against or for what Modi and the current government has done for India, but the reality is in the last few years, it has become easier to open startups. It has become easier to get funding. It has become easier to attract good talent who want to get into startups rather than TCS or Reliance or one of the big companies there, right? Like so. For sure. For us, I mean, we started our India business like a year ago. We were invited by the then current ambassador to do something in India with our tech. So absolutely.
So tell us about Transcelestial, the genesis of that, how it came about. Just give us some background to your company and the space you operate in.
Yeah, sure. So I mean, just finishing off the 4 phases, I think. So from NTU, I was quite heavily involved in a lot of projects that we were doing in NTU, and one of them was Singapore was building their first indigenous satellite. So before that, most countries would just buy something from Airbus or Lockheed or someone else. But it became very important for Singapore to build an own indigenous capability of getting to space. So I was part of that initial project. Prof. Lokesun was running it, who runs space research in NUS right now. And it was a joint collaboration between the university and Department of Defense here. And it took us 10 years, very long, but we actually did send up a satellite. I worked on it for few months to a year, I think, if I remember correctly. But it was a great experience for me to kind of understand what it takes to build space tech. But when I was graduating, we didn't have 2011. We didn't have like big companies like Google and Facebook and stuff here. So the only engineering jobs were either you go to the Defense Department, which as a foreigner you can't, or you go to investment banking, and you have like really good like electronic trading systems and stuff that you can work on. So which is where I ended up. So that was phase 3 of life, doing high frequency trading or more electronic FX to be exact, for RBS.
Yeah.
And it was also like a huge amount of, we were the trading team, but we were also the engineering team. So at some point we kind of built our own custom machines. We rewrote the Linux kernel to boot up within like less than a second, arrays of FPGAs and all of that. So everything was just like vertically integrated into a trading system which worked. So that was great for 4 years, but what ended up happening was I kind of got to a point where I had been suggesting a lot of like improvements within the finance system. How can we innovate rather than just wait for innovation to hit us, like blockchain and stuff? And a lot of those kind of suggestions didn't pan out, or the management didn't care. And I realized that the finance industry only innovates when they want to prevent itself from disruption. So they're not really looking at doing something good. So that was the breaking point for me. So 2015, I ended that, and I was like, look, I don't want to spend more time in this. Life is very short. It has to be meaningful, and it has to be a place where you're excitingly discovering things in the unknown rather than sitting on your ass and doing trading all day long. So that's where kind of shifted gears. Took a year off just to kind of get back into the core of science and physics and stuff, and traveled the world a bit, looking at staying a few months in every ecosystem. So I stayed in Amsterdam, Tel Aviv, US, Kerala for a while, just trying to understand. At that point, it was more like trying to understand what's the strengths, what's the state of art, of technology and business today, and what these centers are really good at.
Was that deliberately because you were looking to start a business, or was that a little bit of self-discovery as well as to what you wanted to do next?
Yeah, so it was both. So back in uni, I did a minor in entrepreneurship, so one of the things about people coming from developing nations is that the only exposure you have to entrepreneurship is these like brands which have existed for 50, 100, 200 years. So you don't even know what it takes to start a business, or what does starting a business really mean. You're only seeing full-fledged companies, right? So NT was the first time I got to understand start to end what it takes to actually start a venture and how people can actually create a lot of value in a short amount of time. But I had no practical experience. Yeah. And that was my attempt to push myself into these ecosystems and understand what it takes for people to create a unicorn, effectively. The word wasn't there at that point in time, but $1 billion company in less than 10 years. Right? And how does that happen? And what are the relative strengths of the ecosystems around the world? Yeah.
So at that point, you felt compelled to learn more about starting businesses, or to actually, I've made the decision, I want to start a business, and then looking for what technology to build, or was it all came together in one flash of insight?
Kind of both. So very first thing that happened was two of my friends graduated from Wharton, and they were creating this app company, and they were both like classic business people, had no idea how tech works. They were like, right, we want an app which does this. They're like,
let's go write an app. Yeah.
They were like, dude, I heard you have left RBS. Like, can you just help us out with this? So I joined them as the temporary CTO for 2 months. So during that process, I was involved with the fundraising, and that was the first time I kind of learned how fundraising really works, which was great. I kind of wrote their 2-year product roadmap, got their first CTO and their team in. They got sold eventually to MediaCorp, which is great.
We'll come back to fundraising later, because I'm fascinated as to how early stage companies do that. And I'm sure people listening to this, that's one of the compelling reasons why they are not starting a business today, because maybe they just don't know how to do it. So I know you've navigated that very successfully.
It is an art and science, but that was part one. It kind of gave me a little bit more confidence. But the second one, during that time, so there was a lot of things converging right within that period of 2015, 2016. Elon at that point of time had for the first time shown that you could land rockets back. So the first reusable rocket during that period landed back. And that was a huge, I think, 0 to 1 moment for us, especially everyone who is a sci-fi nerd living and thinking about how we could actually traverse stars at some point in time. You could see also that for the first time, apart from NASA and European Space Agency and Japanese space agencies, how could private money and private sector get involved with space? Because there's huge multi-trillion-dollar
So
economy
space
lying
was
out
calling. Still space calling, all the way back from Asimov.
there. It's a space calling. So once I saw that, I knew that that would be a trajectory I would want to go on effectively. And looking at Elon's kind of history, like he did PayPal, he did a software company, which got him the money to then build a hardware company. The reality is, there's this thing which I had it in mind at that point, which is called the world of atoms versus world of bits. So in the last 30 years, world of bits, which is computers, networking, all of that stuff, has dramatically improved, right? Has taken leaps and bound growth. But the world of atoms actually hasn't changed much. So if you just take this room and if you take out the displays here that we have, you can't tell the difference between 2023 and 1990. It's pretty much the same stuff. So changing the world of atoms and accelerating that became kind of like a life mission. And I think to some extent, seeing all the hardware growing up in the city has some aspect to play there as well. Long story short, I decided to start a software company, a SaaS company. So that was basically a full-grown CRM and operating system for running a creative talent agency. So one of my friends runs one of the most successful talent agencies here in Singapore. And then we wrote like a minimum software suite, me and another friend of mine and 3 other engineers. We got LA and CA as customers. We were revenue positive, cash flow positive in 3 months. And it was a great way my aim was like in 5 years, I would sell this company, have enough money to then go do something in space.
Right.
And that was when Entrepreneur First came knocking. And that's an accelerator. One of my mates from the Barclays desk in London set up his machine learning company in their cohort in the UK. And when they wanted to start a cohort in Singapore, he was like, well, you're one of the perfect people to join that cohort. So I went and talked to the guy who was running that, and then he was like, look, what you're doing today with Star Agent, which is the name of the software company, is great, but tell me more. What are the things you want to do? And I was like, look, for space industry, for us to get multiplanetary, we need 3 things to get us there. Number 1 is we need an Uber in space, which is Elon and a bunch of other boys are doing a great job right now. The second is we need energy, not only to produce, but distribute and also store, right? And you can't do it through all the stuff that we have here. It has to be either nuclear or antimatter or some other stuff. Sun is quite weak in space, so you can't use solar as well. And the third is comms. Every time we have had a jump in communication technology, our civilization has moved a step forward. Whether we're going from fire to carrier pigeons to undersea copper cables to fiber cables eventually, right? So if we want to get there, we want to be able to communicate with robotic missions to moon to set up habitats and deep space objects and stuff. And that's how we expand. So I didn't see any company leading the charge in energy or communications, and I felt comms would be... So that was really at that point where I joined EF, effectively, and met Danish. And the story takes a different turn then.
So you didn't have a point, an aha moment. You actually worked outside in terms of
Completely.
big picture, and then came down to the point where you kicked off
Very
Transcelestial.
much, yeah.
Wow.
Very much.
So can we just move the conversation forward a little bit into Transcelestial itself?
Yeah.
Because what year did you start it?
2016, December.
2016, and you mentioned Dinesh earlier, who's your co-founder and CTO of the business.
Yeah.
What made you get to that point that you really said, now's the time, let's go do this?
Yeah, so it was really the way EF program works is that they get a group of individuals together, and you kind of form a company at the intersection of your capabilities. So actually, at that point in time, I had an idea where we could use lasers to power satellites to move at 20% speed of light. Right. And I needed someone who had experience in quantum lasers, graphene, plasmonics, metamaterial tech. So day one, I show up to the cohort. and everyone's talking about building blockchain apps and shit like that. And so I asked the guy who's running the thing, is there any quantum physicists here? And he's like, there's one. This guy, Dinesh.
Yeah.
And this is like literally 1 hour into the whole thing. We break for coffee. I take Dinesh out into the balcony, and we start talking about all of this stuff that we
I
have
remember
been
this
talking
conversation
about.
on the balcony. You've referenced that before, so yeah.
And then we started growing hungry, which has been a constant theme of our friendship over the last few decades, for the last few years, sorry. So we went to have biryani lunch, which was great. And then we ordered a second biryani, and the conversation just ended up for hours and hours.
And did you focus
And by the
on-
end, we knew we were going to. So initially, it started with energy, and we realized that we would have to build like gigawatt-class lasers in orbit. And then we realized an Indian and an Iranian would not be allowed to make gigawatt-class lasers because it's basically an energy weapon. So we started thinking about, okay, how can we then use this? Because light can be used to transmit data as well. So how can we pivot to looking at comms in deep space and make a telecommunication company instead?
Because you got the idea together, and how did you bootstrap it from a funding point of view? Was it running around friends and family, or how did you kick the thing off?
We pitched in, so as part of the EF program, it's kind of like YC, where you have to pitch in front of an investment committee internally, and they give you like around 100K effectively to just kickstart the whole thing. And they were just like blown away by the ambition and the scale of all of this and stuff. And so they were like, yep, thumbs up, like here's 100K. But that's not enough. That's enough for me and Dinesh to pay ourselves some salaries.
That was the first
for a
check,
while.
as it were.
That was the first check for us.
So at that point, it was still an idea on paper. You
Very
didn't have
much.
anything demo,
Nothing,
POC,
zero.
nothing to show.
So,
to say.
oh, that's, yeah. So, I mean, again, that's a little bit of details, but the way we got that 100K check was we did a little bit of demo that demo, actually, you can see it in the office today. It's a $15 demo, which is super cool. So you take a very cheap laser pointer, you connect it to a headphone jack, the old school ones, and you plug it into your phone. And when you press a music play, that analog signal goes to the laser. It modulates the signal of the laser.
So it's an MVP with an
It's
emphasis
an
on the
MVP.
M.
Very much, very minimal. So you can actually shine that laser to a tiny solar panel, which is then connected to a speaker.
Right.
And once it hits the speaker, music starts coming out,
Yeah,
right?
clever.
So what we showed to the investment committee was when you're standing close, you can actually transmit data through lasers. So that's one tick in the box. But we started walking away from each other. And at that point, it becomes very hard to keep the laser stable. So the idea was that you can transmit data, but the IP we have to develop is laser stabilization over long distances. And that's been our core patent.
So you got the idea together, you got a minimum viable product together, you got a bit of funding. How did you then attract others to buy into your vision and actually abandon what they were doing and pile into your business?
For us, one thing that's worked, and I think it works for a lot of deep tech companies, is an overarching mission. So you asked about whether there was a simple idea that invoked it. So it's actually the overarching mission for the next 5, 10, 20, 50 years. That can we build a communication technology for the future of human civilization? And so that attracted our first employee, Max. We put together a deck. We filed a patent for our approach, which was what we could barely do from the cash we had. And I started pitching, Dinesh and I started pitching to all the VCs here, right? They all had come. EF had a demo day, which was very great because they invited all the VCs in Singapore. Some of them flew from overseas to see. And this was the first time a Singapore ecosystem was seeing something so crazy and bananas from a type of company point of view. Because till now, they had been seeing folks like, I mean, no offense, but like folks like Carousel and Grab and things like that, which are like a lot of app-based stuff. But now they were seeing lasercom companies. They were seeing companies which were doing like building management with IoT and like using a lot of hardware and software stitching and stuff together.
So for people listening to this that want to know how you went from that idea to actually telling the story, what was the learning that you went through up front about telling the story in a way that made investors actually open their checkbooks?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think our pitch was mainly centered around the kind of big picture idea of what goals we were trying to hit. So if I go back and look at our either pitch from EF, which is still on YouTube, so one can find it, and also our first investment deck, it was very much centered around like if we are able to build this technology and if we're able to build this technology at scale, right, what can it do for the terrestrial connectivity market, and what can it do to completely transform the space industry?
See, that's interesting, because I would have thought these guys who are writing checks would have been very interested in the shorter term money.
Yep.
Is this going to be
Me too,
profitable?
me too, yeah.
Is this going to give me a return? And what you're saying is the bigger picture, the story, the vision that they bought into is actually the thing that made the difference.
100%.
Amazing.
And this is the other thing which people don't get about Silicon Valley is, so often the joke is that the seed rounds are PowerPoint rounds, and
Yeah.
Series A and onwards is
Yeah,
Excel
spreadsheets,
rounds.
yeah, absolutely.
So, but that doesn't mean like, I mean, you can't bullshit your way across stuff, right? There has to be credible, it has to be logical and stuff. But a lot of the big Silicon Valley kind of leaps ahead, and the biggest companies that you have, they are actually talking about an idea. Dropbox was not saying that you'll get this tool which can help you upload, download stuff. They were saying that people are going to have all their information in the cloud, right? And if your vision makes sense, and Jeff Bezos calls it like your vision of the future, you're basically projecting how the world will look like 50 years from now. And all you're doing is walking backwards. So it can be one of the alternate worlds that exist. But if you work towards that, you can shift our global narrative to that alternate reality.
But was that a function you mentioned,
Yeah.
Silicon Valley versus the
Yeah.
sort of Singapore, Southeast Asia investment market? Is there a big difference? I mean, someone obviously had the vision in terms of we see where you're trying to go. And to Bill's point, we both said we thought they want a much shorter view in terms of return.
I think that's just generally the difference between, I would say, anything happening in Silicon Valley for the last few decades versus the rest of the world. So even if you take Asia or Europe combined, the kind of businesses that were being formed here, or maybe to some extent are still being formed here, to their credit, they think about break even and getting to cash flow positive and getting to like, okay, how can I build something quick which can iterate and get to early revenues and stuff. And to some extent, that's great, right? That was a business I also built like just before starting Transcelestial. But the reality is that those kind of businesses usually don't have the overarching impact or the ability to transform that some of the bigger longer-term vision companies have usually. And that's the one that usually are fund returners, or the ones which basically end up changing how we do things, actually, by default. It changes the default of how we do things. And that's, to me, is the best definition of deep tech. Someone told me, it's like, if you build this, it will be the default of doing things going ahead.
So
and that's what Silicon Valley invests in.
Yeah, if we move it forwards, you've got the business, it's growing now. You're in the market. What are you taking to market today? And what is the technology that is making the difference for you to enable you to break into the market?
Yeah.
And what is the market you're addressing right now?
Yeah, good question. So what we pitched at that point was that eventually we're building this laser comms, which is going to be the most valuable and the default piece of technology driving comms in deep space. But if this is a technology of the future from 20, 30 years from now, it should be also able to transform and change lives today of who we are on the planet. So we took this idea to some of the telcos. So StarHub being one of the first ones we started talking to here, SK Telecom being, and that was a major pivotal point in Transcelestial's history, the Koreans. We started talking to them and we said, look, if we provide you with a wireless fiber optics technology, which can be set up instantly, provides exactly the same speed as fiber, how is that going to change your business today?
What was the reaction?
Oh, it was like, we got two sets of reactions. One was like, from the SKs of the world, it was like, this is amazing. We are just rolling out 5G. We are 2 years ahead of everyone. And 5G is a huge, on paper, it's a loss for every telco to roll out a 5G network, unless you can swap out the costs of putting fiber with doing something wirelessly, right? So for them,
was there disbelief at this point that this worked?
That was the second part, which we were not prepared for. So unknown to us, actually, the U.S. defense contracting arms, like Lockheed's and BAE's and all of these, they had been building laser comms, but they were $1 million terminals. They were not ready for the commercial market, and often they were not reliable in rain. So there were some telcos around the world who had tried using laser comms 10, 15 years ago with very old school technology, and it just didn't work more than a few hundred meters.
So you've actually gone and developed your own IP to get over those, say, environmental issues around, rain and...
100%. So the turning point for a lot of the telcos was when they were like, oh, this doesn't even work beyond 100 meters. And we were like, well, our first prototype does a kilometer. They were like,
Yeah.
oh, show us.
Yeah.
And that was the SK Telecom
Yeah.
trial. We ran it for
Yeah.
2 months, and it survived 2 major hurricanes effectively, and was still providing connectivity to a library 600, 700 meters away effectively. And they were like, this is amazing, right? And that I think was the big disbelief to belief turning point.
So
for
flipping
us.
to your leadership now, you've got the team running.
Yeah.
You're operating a larger organization now. The business has been scaling. How do you attract and retain your talent into your organization? How do you differentiate when you say, come work for Transcelestial versus work for somebody else?
Yeah, that's a good question. One of the things which I learned at my banking career was that, I mean, this is pretty common knowledge, is that if you hire A team, they hire A team, and you get A quality work effectively. So when we started looking at folks, we basically had no rules around who we wanted to hire globally and how much money we would want to spend on getting that person.
So it was a global talent search
From day one.
not just locally in
From day
Singapore.
one, yeah. Because we knew that like this company, effectively, if we get it successful, has implications worldwide.
And was
Right.
that also because of the scarcity of the type of talent you needed?
Potentially, yeah. So the kind of folks that we needed, especially certain skill sets on low latency coding, on FPGAs, on photonics and optoelectronics and stuff, didn't necessarily exist here. We spared no
So it's
expense.
not the kind of talent that universities are pumping
very
out by the thousand. It's
No,
pretty-
it's not.
Pretty scarce, right?
Yeah.
It's
So
pretty
how do you
scarce,
draw
yeah.
those people to come and work in Singapore? You talk
And how
about
do you
Silicon
keep them
Valley.
once you've got them? I mean,
Yeah, so that the second one is a lot more challenging than the first one, especially from the big fangs, the Facebooks and the Apples and stuff. They're pretty good at throwing cash incentives where startups are not. But okay, I'll just summarize to like 2 things. Number one was we in our interview process we did 2 things. When we were interviewing people, like
Yep.
what have you actually done? Number 2 we looked at was like do you have a history of seeking out hard problems? Like, are you the one who pokes around in different departments and like different things and be like, why is that broken? Okay, let me go fix that. Right?
disruptors.
Yeah. And
Okay.
do you have a history of doing that? So it's not just once, but have you done it twice or thrice? So that shows that if you bring you in, one of the core kind of engineering mantras we had was question the constraint. So every single thing while building the first patent and the first terminal was question why the industry is doing it this way. Question why this has been done in the
So
past
ha-
in this
so
way.
it's-
And you need
again-
people who already brought
So
that
I've always
mentality in.
believed in hiring because of attitude as the priority and ability probably second. Now, with such narrow seam that you're mining on ability, how do you then get the attitude right as well? Is that trial and error with this, or how do you prioritize the type of people that would fit into the Transcelestial way, for example?
Yeah, so it was, you're absolutely right. It's attitude and ability, but often people just go for ability.
Yeah.
But we were quite open to taking someone who was second or third in ability, but number 1 in attitude.
Yeah. Okay.
Because the
that makes
reality
sense.
is like, I mean, you guys have seen startups, right? Like the journey is never a straight line up, right? There's huge valleys and peaks and stuff, right? Like, and the more than the financial toll, the emotional toll is even greater and longer. And if you don't have people who can sit through with you on that ups and downs, to whatever size you grow the company to, it doesn't matter, then it becomes quite difficult. So you have to be very stringent in picking those people
So
up.
how much
and
was
I'm usually the gatekeeper on that.
So how
because-
much is the draw for you in terms of like you're doing really cool stuff with lasers, come in,
Yeah.
work to this space, come and work and do cool stuff with technology versus the compensation piece of it? I mean,
Yeah, so it's a mix of both. So on one side, compensation was huge. So one thing people didn't understand was Singapore has a very low personal income tax, which was great because we were paying Silicon Valley
I
salaries.
hadn't noticed.
But most of people, when you say overseas, especially in Europe and US, you're like, Singapore, they think it's China. Like most of them don't even know where Singapore is, right?
Yeah.
So you have to we literally had written down a guide on Welcome to Singapore, which we actually distributed to other startups. And it told them that you'll be paid Silicon Valley salaries. You don't have to pay 40% taxes. Your living standard is equal, if not better, than Silicon Valley or other places where you're living in. And we will pay for relocation and everything, and we will guarantee jobs for you for the next few years. Right?
So we've covered the
it's-
past a bit.
Yeah.
We've touching on the present, but in the future, where do you see this going as a business in Asia Pacific? Is this the kind of thing
Yeah.
where Singapore is an ideal hub for you? You're going to grow in Asia Pacific, or are you trying to take on the rest of the world now at the same time?
Where we are going from here. So both from a business and a funding point of view. So in the early days, we got a lot of advice to move to Silicon Valley because that's where as an ambitious company, you're supposed to be. But Dinesh and I had a lot of early networks in this part of the region. We belong from a developing part of the world, and we felt that most of the need for connectivity was in this part of the world. So we wanted to be close to our user base.
Is that because the infrastructure here is less adequate than the rest of the world? Because I've
yeah.
sat in Silicon Valley and my bandwidth from a hotel there has been appalling. So I've got huge bandwidth here in Singapore. So where do you see as the opportunity to grow?
Yeah.
Is it here, there, where?
Yes, again, it was a great place for us to build a team and a company away from the limelight of Silicon Valley, so we could just focus on work, right? Not get distracted. But one of the interesting things is if you take Singapore as a center and you draw, I forget the name of the circle or the economist who did this, but if you draw a big circle around that point, there are more people living inside that circle than outside in the world. So huge opportunity in this part of the world. And
So if you could go back and do it
this
all
is-
over again, would you still use Singapore as
100%.
your starting place? That's great to hear.
100%, yeah. 100% do it in Singapore. One of the kind of, I wouldn't say challenges, but one of the kind of, what makes it more harder for us here in the region is that our three markets are Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, and they all speak different languages. They have different ways of doing business and everything. It's very exciting, but it's also challenging for a small team. Versus US is, to some extent, a singularly lingual market. Although the ways of doing business is still different in California.
Is it Spanish or is it English?
How much time have you had to work out who are the key personas within an organisation you sell to, and then who are the gatekeepers that might want to block it because it's they've got better technology or some reasons not to do it? Have you spent a lot of time working that path through in terms of who's best to approach the technology?
Yeah, for sure. I think so since then, in the early days, our aim was to operate in a large market, which is telecommunications. So the upside is quite high, but then seek out early adopters, right? I mean, I can't mention the exact names of clients today, but in the US, that was also a journey. We had all the major telcos reach out to us the moment they heard a Reuters announcement that we are coming in the US. But we chose the one telco that we knew has a big history of innovating and moving fast and doing things.
But telcos have got
that's
a
what
reputation for doing a lot of proof of concepts. They
Yeah.
want to trial it. They want to test it themselves. And there's a long lead time to sort of saying, yes, we're going to go and do a real POC. I mean, if you managed to circumvent that, is there anything that you've learned in terms of what works to get that
Yeah.
faster
And particularly in
trial?
this part of the world. I mean,
Yeah. The reality is it's more like who is a faster turtle, right? In that sense.
I like that. Good way of putting it.
And there has been a few kind of telltale signs of that. So yes, we have been able to. It's taken a bit longer, but almost everyone said that like cracking a telco would take like year plus, year and a half to 2 years. On an average for us, the way we pick telcos is that can we get quick access? Do we have a great partner on the ground who has an excellent relationship with that telco? That's number one. But number two, are there senior leaders willing to talk to us? Because if they are, then you know very quickly whether they have a mentality of trying something new or innovative, and are they looking at things to try? And if the senior leaders don't want to talk to young startups or young companies, they just don't understand that they can disrupt a market with new technology. So that's been our kind of litmus test, to be honest, to start off with. And what that has helped us do is that, yes, it was quite painful to sometimes to work with the telcos, but they also represent the biggest opportunity in a country, right? And the fastest way to make an impact. So on the side, we were dealing with smaller broadband and enterprises to just keep revenue flowing, but really our focus was like, how could we get like 3 or 5 of these major telcos?
does it ever come up, the fact that you are a Singapore company, you're actually manufacturing in Singapore as well, which is pretty unusual. Do they ever turn around and say, how do they react when you talk about the quality of it, the cost of it? Because most people read reviews on Bloomberg or whatever it may be that Singapore's an expensive place to be. So do they naturally assume then that your offers are more expensive or more competitive than other countries?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. Like that is literally the first reaction when you tell them that, like, oh, you're manufactured. They ask, like, where do you manufacture? And we're like, Singapore. They're like, oh, is that why you guys are expensive? Why don't you go to China? I was like, okay, if I move to China, will you buy a Chinese manufactured equipment in telecom? They're like, oh, actually, no.
Yeah.
Yep.
So there's what has happened is with the whole Huawei thing and the ZTE thing and stuff, like the world has gotten increasingly more knowledgeable about, okay, telecom is a very critical infrastructure piece and you want to be very sure where your hardware is originating from. So Singapore, in some sense, manufacturing here has helped us in two ways. The second one, I can guarantee most people don't know that it's a benefit. So number one is neutrality. Singapore is great, especially if you are operating in defense or telecom or other kind of, and there's a quality reputation here as well. But the second thing is Singapore has the largest amount of free trade agreements around the world. So today, actually, like when we are, let's say, on paper competing with equipment from Ericsson or Huawei or Nokia and stuff, they all have somewhere between 10 to 15% import taxes and duties. Singapore, in all the markets we work in, has 0%.
Yeah, that's good to know.
So a company that started, grown, coming to scale very nicely, penetrating markets all over the world. If you were to now meet some guys at university who had similar views that they want to start their own business, what would be tips and tricks that you might want to give these guys?
Yeah.
Particularly around getting that original idea funded, because so many people say, I've got a great idea, but I've no idea how to go around the fundraising part of it.
So I would say there's so many things, right? Like, but I would maybe like crystallize it to just 3 areas. The first one is it's very important what idea you work on. That actually is quite important because your time, I'd say, like, we as humans, we work in time scales of decades. Every decade, you must reevaluate what you're trying to do and what you're doing and transform yourself. So a quick hack that works if you're trying to build ambitious companies is imagine what does the world look like in 50 years? And imagine in as much detail as you can, right? How would city life look like? How would home life look like? How would this look like?
But isn't the critical thing, I've identified a real problem that I'm going to fix? And isn't that counterintuitive to what you're saying about these longer term vision type goals?
Yeah, so so maybe stepping back, there's many types of companies you can build. So of course, if let's say you are a professional, you've worked 10 years and you know, okay, I've been in this industry, I know this one problem, and if I build a company for a solution, I can provide a solution for that problem and someone will pay me, and that's fine. My recommendation is don't go venture funded, bootstrap, because you know the problem, you know who's going to pay for it, and solution most likely can be put together from something that exists.
Don't get venture funding. Was that the message?
Do not get venture funding, because venture funding comes with huge amounts of pressure. And I've done both kinds of companies, so I can tell that like very well. Venture funding comes with a lot of pressure, and it's only a specific reason why you would want to take venture funding. So if you already know a problem and you know you can build a solution to that specific problem and get paid, do it bootstrapped as much as possible.
That's
right?
right.
Or use like debt or something like that. There's a lot of folks, get an angel investor.
What would be another coaching point for people trying to start a business right now, particularly in the tech space or deep tech space?
Yeah, so the first one that I said, like if you know a problem and a solution and stuff, just go for it. And that's also to some extent kind of true on if you're building an app or if you're building an online web portal and stuff. These things with tools have become so incredibly easier. Like you can do it on your own weekend, right? Like if you are saying an excuse that, oh, I don't know how to code, so I can't put a website together. No, that's not an excuse anymore, right? So for that, I would say figure out what the problem is. I mean, pretty standard stuff. Figure out the problem is, go and talk to at least 3 people who can validate that problem and would buy a solution for that.
What about personal things? This is where Singapore is an expensive country, right? The rent's very high compared to other countries right now, and arguably going higher. Some people saying getting lower, but it's expensive. if you're going to start a business, that implies that you've got to stop working somewhere else, which means your salary dries up, and that's quite a scary moment, isn't it, for people?
It is.
Wouldn't Singapore, therefore, again, be counterintuitive for people to do that?
So again, like all of this advice is quite subjective to what I'm giving, and I'm pretty sure other people will have very different opinion. But every single friend of mine who has come and said that, like, oh, I'm working, and mostly these are like people still in banking industry. They're like, I want this fat paycheck to keep coming, but I also want to start a startup on the side. And I told them it just doesn't work. It's like dating two women at the same time, right? Like it just does not work at the end of the day. You have to commit yourself to one person and one idea, right? So you're right, like especially for families. So it's much easier. So this is one suggestion. If you're single, and if you're in your 20s, this is the time for you to do it.
Take a risk.
Yeah. Or if you are late 40s, early 50s, and your kids have gone to university, this is the
Take a
time to
risk.
do for it.
What about
It's
fear of
very
failure?
difficult.
So many people are
when you're
held
in
back
family.
by fear of failure. People coming out of university, they've got parental expectations, friends, you've got to be employed, you've got to grow well, you've got to get the latest cars, houses, all this kind of stuff. Therefore, failure doesn't fit into it. Isn't fear of failure something that actually you've got to ignore if you're an entrepreneur?
Yeah.
Failure's a badge of honor, isn't it?
I think it has to also do. So you see, it's a bit different. I mean, you've been to the Valley in the U.S., right? The mentality,
Many times.
The mentality towards failure is a bit different.
Yeah.
And I kind of blame the press and the media and the social narrative here, a bit of that. Like even growing up, right? Like you cannot fail at anything because failure is seen as something that's socially makes you a pariah at the end of the day. But the reality is completely opposite. The reality is that as humans, we learn the most from failures. We don't, like, you will remember the things you screwed up, even I remember all the things we screwed up in 6 years, then compared to a quarter which went great.
Yeah, I'm a big believer there's only winning or learning. There's no winning or losing, right?
So-
It's just winning or learning.
So here, that's what I keep telling everyone, that like it doesn't matter. Actually, there's also statistics to prove that the most amount of unicorn companies that's been built in the enterprise, B2B, deep tech space, or even in the app space are consistently the ones which is done by serial entrepreneurs.
There you go.
People who have at least fundraised, or like Sam Altman, he had all his previous companies failed. He had to close them, it went bankrupt, etc.
I've had conversations with guys in the Valley, and they almost look down on each other. It's like, you've only had 4 failures, you know. Why? I've had 7. I'm better than you are. And yet, when I go home to the UK and talk to people over there, fear of failure holds back people so much.
It's so much. And actually, there's a practical reason for that, like to think that failure should be helping you, because once you fail at something, you can look back and you will never repeat that. For example, if you're, let's say you start something and you failed and it was because you ran out of cash, you will never run out of cash in your future again.
Yeah.
If you fail because you hired a B team, you would never hire B team again, right? So
So to that point, when in your day-to-day running of the business, what advice would you give to other startups in terms of where should they spend the time? You've got a great technology, you believe in the technology, and you can sometimes get sort of sucked into believing that. So, you know, you're the best. But where do you spend your time, and what's important? What areas do people need to look at to keep an eye on the overall business?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I'm usually nervous about answering questions like these because advice is subjective. And so I'd rather give questions to people. And also, like, my advice is quite relevant to the longest I've worked at building a company is a deep tech company. So some of this may not apply to, like, if you want to build, if you know a problem.
There is
area,
a well-known expression, which is wise men never give advice because fools never take it.
That's a great one. I love it. But if you are building a B2B company, if you are building something like reasonably technical or engineering-led or B2B or deep tech-led, there's a few things. So number one is invest in a mission that's broader than you and the current problem you're trying to solve, right? For us, so that tomorrow if you or your co-founder or your team get hit by a truck, the team can keep going for the mission. And I think that overarching stuff is quite important. The second is, I think when we kind of talk to our board and when we talk to our investors and stuff, a lot of the time we are asked, like, what's your net burn? What's your runway and stuff? So one of almost every company that I know of today, the way they do this is like they will project some revenues and some bookings and stuff. And I've been quite adamant to be like, assume 0 revenue comes in. how long can we run? And this is something which I kind of advise a lot of
That's your
my
cash runway,
peers.
yeah.
Yeah. What's your assuming you can't fire all the people today, assuming like your customers stop paying you everything, you get zero sales, how long can you run? And make sure that's at least 6 months, right? At least minimum. Because to do anything, you need 6 months,
Yep.
right? You'll cry for the first month, and then for the next 5, you'll get something done. So those are two things. And the third thing is basically people. I mean, it always boils down to people. When you are in really, really, really tough situations, the people who stick around and are ready to take on that pressure with you are the people you want to keep as long as possible with you, effectively.
Excellent. It's great words of wisdom. Thank you. Also, the journey with Transcelestial is great. Your own journey, fascinating. Thank you so much for coming in and chatting with us today. I think the pair of us have learned a lot, and it's very encouraging to see Singapore's companies in Singapore in the deep tech and tech space are doing so well and thriving. So again, thank you so much for coming along today and sharing part of your journey.
Yeah, thank you so much.